Спасибо. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги, ваше превосходительство. Признательны за...
Good afternoon, colleagues, Your Excellency. I am grateful for the lively interest you show in our position on the Ukrainian problem and on international affairs as a whole. But we traditionally devote this roundtable to the crisis created by the West around Ukraine, turning it into anti-Russia, pumping it with weapons to prepare for a war unleashed against our country. Of course, this is one of the most acute issues on the international agenda, although frankly speaking, we see attempts to use the sharpness of this controversy around Ukraine, including at international forums, in order to distract attention from others.
This includes, of course, the Palestinian problem.
We welcomed the actions taken by President Trump, and, as a result of the first stage of his initiative, people were freed, hostages were returned, so that, in accordance with religious traditions, they would be devoted to the land. But now, we are all waiting for the start of the second stage, and the fact that the plan, despite all its humanitarian nature, does not provide for a final, reliable solution to the Palestinian issue in accordance with the UN resolutions, certainly does not add to our optimism.
Nevertheless, we have gathered here to discuss the Ukrainian crisis, and if you allow me, I will say a few words expressing our assessment of the current stage of the situation around this topic. We are now meeting every day, several times a day, in the media, and we hear assessments that contribute to new expectations, such as the approach to diplomatic resolution of the conflict around Ukraine. All these assessments and expectations contribute to the activation of contacts between various international players. And all this is happening in the background of reports that in the economies of the sponsors of the Kyiv regime, primarily the Euro bureaucrats and the majority of NATO and the European Union members, there is a growing crisis in these countries. There is a lot of speculation, various destructive throws and lies. Therefore, we see the main purpose of such actions initiated by our Western colleagues is to complicate the search for a negotiated solution and delay the conflict, including by playing against the initiative of the United States and President Trump, which are really aimed at finding solutions that will facilitate the elimination of the primary causes of the Ukrainian crisis. No one in Europe mentions the primary causes at all and demands only one thing: immediately stop the hostilities. Let Ukraine and us Europeans breathe. Win time in order to at least a little support the Kyiv regime with weapons and money. I would like to draw your attention to the latest news.
As reported by the media, there were contacts on the phone between President Trump, Macron, Starmer, Friedrich Merz, and the official representative of the Federal Republic of Germany, Mr. Cornelius, who made a public statement saying that 4 heads of state and government discussed the course of negotiations on the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. That is all.
Europe is not interested in anything else.
We insist on achieving a package of agreements on a strong, stable, and long-term world with guarantees of security for all parties involved. Our negotiations with the President of the United States and his team are dedicated to this, to the search for a long-term settlement in order to eliminate the primary causes of this crisis.
Western Europe, as can be seen from the statement of the official representative of the Federal Republic of Germany,
thinks only about stopping the hostilities, breathing, and again preparing Zelensky and his regime for the war against the Russian Federation. Therefore, today we will try to separate the seeds from the seedlings, analyze the dynamics of the events of the current year, and try to inform you on how we assess the accumulated experience which, one way or another, affects the decision-making on negotiations, formats, deadlines, and prospects. First of all, I would like to give you a brief historical overview.
I know that many of you are aware of the background of this issue.
Nevertheless, I would like to remind you once again that during the Biden administration, the United States became the main sponsor of the Kyiv regime. After the bloody coup d'etat in February 2014, the then Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, speaking in the Senate hearings, proudly said that the right processes were taking place in Ukraine. It was not in vain that we have invested $5 billion in this country over the past few years so that the tendencies that they call the triumph of democracy prevail there. In fact, it was just a coup. The Americans established control over the political system and economy of Ukraine as a result of this coup. They pumped Ukrainian neo-Nazis with modern weapons. All this was inherited by Donald Trump. At the same time, we remember that one of his most prominent and most important pre-election slogans of an external political nature was the immediate cessation of the Ukrainian conflict. It is necessary to pay tribute to the current American leader. After his return to the White House, he really dealt with this issue and, in our opinion, is sincerely striving to contribute to the overcoming of the conflict through political and diplomatic methods. We welcome this, but of course, one desire is not enough. We need practical steps to eliminate the very root causes of the conflict, which the President of Russia and members of his government have repeatedly laid out and which are unacceptable to us. The withdrawal of Ukraine from NATO, contrary to the promises made over the past 35 years, and the unacceptability for us of the extermination of the entire Russian by the Ukrainian regime in violation of the UN Charter and numerous conventions, as well as the Constitution of Ukraine, which requires the guarantee of the rights of the Russian and other national minorities in all spheres of society. Since the very beginning of the crisis, Russia has done everything possible to regulate it. In February 2014, when a coup d'etat was carried out in Kyiv, we turned to the leadership of France, Germany, and Poland and called on them to influence the opposition, which, in general, organized the coup d'etat with the support and guiding role of the West, and asked the Europeans, mentioned by me, to demand from the opposition to comply with the document on political settlement signed literally the day before with the then president of Ukraine. After all, both Berlin, Warsaw, and Paris were guarantors of the implementation of the agreement, and their signatures were there. And we simply said, guys, you have put your reputation on the map. Do something to make sense of it, to put it in order. If this had happened, if Germany, France, and Poland had fulfilled their obligations as guarantors of the agreement, Ukraine could have avoided a civil war, which the regime, which came to power as a result of the coup d'etat, immediately unleashed against those millions of Ukrainian citizens who categorically refused to recognize the legitimacy of this regime. Therefore, considering that the West already then, 11 years ago, even almost 12, simply refused to fulfill its own obligations, this once again gives an answer to the question of how sincerely these European capitals wanted peace in Ukraine. Nevertheless, Russia continued its diplomatic efforts. As you know, the Minsk agreements were agreed on as a result of a long-hour, nightly negotiating work in the capital of Belarus, in which President Putin participated. They were agreed upon, and on the initiative of Russia, we did this on purpose, unanimously approved by the UN Security Council. Article 25 of the UN Charter states that all UN members, without exception, must comply with the decisions of the Security Council. However, these decisions were seen by the West as merely buying time in order to continue to build up the illegal Kyiv regime with weapons in order to continue the line of preparation for the war against the Russian Federation. And those who signed these Minsk agreements from France and the FRG, President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel, as well as the former president of Ukraine, whose signature is also, of course, under this document, they only wanted to buy time. They honestly admitted this. A couple of years ago, in an interview, already in the midst of a special military operation, they said that no one was going to fulfill these agreements. We needed them to correct the disastrous situation of the Ukrainian armed forces, and thereby prepare Ukraine for the war with the Russian Federation. And the so-called contact groups, which were also created by the decision of the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, France and Germany.
and which were intended to help implement the Minsk agreements. But all this was sabotaged by the Kyiv regime and its Western curators. At the same time, the Kyiv regime, with the help of NATO, strengthened its military potential and, as a result, increased the intensity of hostilities against those citizens of the southeast of Ukraine, who, as I have already said, categorically refused to recognize the legitimacy of the putschists, including because, upon coming to power, right in the morning after the coup in February 2014, the putschists announced that they would abolish the status of the Russian language, thus putting millions and millions of Ukrainians out of the law, who have always, like their ancestors, been educated and lived in Russian culture for centuries. The southeast of Ukraine, including Odessa and Nikolaev, are the territories and cities that were created by the Russians. Factories, ports, all this was built by the Russians. And then, as you know, these lands, within the framework of the Soviet Union, were given to those parts of Ukraine that are known as Galicia and other Western territories. Nevertheless, the main thing is that no Minsk agreements were respected. There was no peace process, and the Kyiv regime did not want to negotiate with the residents of the southeast. It publicly said that it would never negotiate with these representatives, although this was a direct requirement of the Minsk agreements. And the fact that at the end of February, at the end of January, at the beginning of February 2022, the Kyiv armed forces repeatedly, several times, increased the number of artillery strikes by combat aircraft on the territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. This was confirmed by the reports of the Special Monitoring Mission of the European Security Organization. But I do not want to go into details. We have talked about this more than once. But the main thing is that Russia gave preference to diplomacy to the last. In December 2021, 2 months before the start of the special military operation, we did not think about anything other than a peaceful settlement, submitted proposals to the United States and the North Atlantic Alliance, documents that were aimed at agreeing on security guarantees in the Western direction. We proposed to sign a legally binding agreement. These proposals were highly rejected by the Americans and NATO, not only after we realized that the West wanted to give carte blanche to the Ukrainian Nazis for the forceful suppression of those who refused to recognize the coup. Only then, as the president said, we had no choice but to start special military operations to protect the population of the southeast of Ukraine, which the Kyiv regime declared inhumans, creatures, terrorists, and against whom, as I said, in violation of all norms of international humanitarian law, used the regular army, including artillery and air force. Nevertheless, even after the start of the special military operation, we did not stop trying to adjust the situation politically. Contacts with the Ukrainian side took place in Belarus a couple of days after the start of the special military operation, and then they continued in the Brest region of Belarus, in Istanbul, and via video communication. However, this dialogue was interrupted not because of our fault. The UK leadership played a very unfavorable role here. Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, ordered Zelensky to abandon the Kyiv's proposed and already paraphrased plan of settlement, and said that the Ukrainians should fight to the end. All this was in the illusory hope of waiting for the collapse of the Russian economy. This was the calculation of this unkempt political figure. We thought that we would be in a deep crisis due to the sanctions pressure, and this would contribute to the political destabilization of Russia, which the West and then, and even now, if we talk about the Europeans, is striving for. In other words, according to the plan of these Western strategists, Ukraine played the role of an anti-Russian ram, and it should have held out until the pressure on our country would break us economically, politically, and probably morally and psychologically, until our determination to defend the unity, sovereignty, security of the state and dignity of the Russian people, who, by the will of the historical judges, have found themselves on the territory of Ukraine and would have lived there if only the Ukrainian leadership respected its own constitution, which, as I said, requires the provision of the rights of the Russian and other national minorities. But we wanted to make a strategic defeat and then dictate our Western conditions on the issues that the European capitals were interested in. But the plan for an anti-Russian blitzkrieg with the use of Ukraine, as you know, failed. The Russian society demonstrated internal consolidation, an economic and political system of stability, and a huge reserve of strength. And of course, this is also a very important point in terms of understanding the historical retrospective. It is not in vain that we are told, whenever Russia was attacked, that our cause is the right one. This conviction in its historical right, in the international legal right, reflects the character of our people, which ensures the current situation in the fight against those who wanted to suppress all our legal rights and interests. Today, as I said at the beginning, in the West, the resources for conducting a proxy war, both financial and military, are running out. The human losses of the armed forces of Ukraine, according to numerous independent estimates, have long exceeded 1 million people and continue to grow. The Kyiv regime, an ideologically charged combat unit, which was fed by the ideology of Nazism, the Azov battalions and other neo-Nazi structures, and, of course, was also fed by some prohibited substances in everyday life, has turned into an organized criminal group, into corruption, which is dragging its sponsors to the bottom. The ruling circles of the West, in these conditions, can be divided into two camps. Most of them are in favor of militarization of the economy of European countries and preparation for a large-scale armed confrontation in Europe. It is obvious that they hope that, as they say, the war will subside and their mistakes will be forgotten. Among such figures, I will mention not anyone, but the head of the NATO Military Committee, Giuseppe Dragone. We think that in order to act more aggressively, instead of reacting, the NATO alliance could consider deterrent strikes as defensive actions. How do you like this? This is because other figures, including military and other politicians, openly say that we need to prepare for the war against Russia by 2030, or even by 2029. It is very funny that the statement of this Italian general about the need for deterrent strikes against the Russian Federation was tried to justify by the Prime Minister of the Italian Republic, Mrs. Giorgia Meloni. When she was asked how she felt about this, she said that these words should be correctly interpreted in order to prevent a dangerous escalation. How else can you interpret words with a direct call to deliver deterrent strikes? I am sure that everyone understands what we are talking about and how the West, out of indifference, is trying to aggravate the situation and stay on the warpath. I hope that by discussing this issue and the so-called military threat from Russia, it will allow them to stay in power and not lose face. According to our assessment, this is the majority of Western elites in Europe. The other so-called minorities still want to find a strategy to get out of the conflict, to find ways to de-escalate, and to create conditions for political regulation. This policy of some European countries is in line with the actions of Trump's administration, which has long gone from words to action, and was able to influence Kyiv, to convince Zelensky to return to working on the negotiating perspective. We appreciate these efforts, as well as the readiness of a number of our partners to provide a platform for contacts. Although, to be honest, Zelensky, with the support of various leaders in Brussels, Berlin, London, and Paris, is trying to sabotage in every possible way and come up with excuses that are aimed only at beating Trump's administration from the path that was chosen with a view to sustainable and long-term regulation. They want to replace all this with some inventions, just so as not to undertake anything. As you know, in the spring of this year, as a confirmation of the fact that we want negotiations and political decisions, in the spring, on our initiative, direct Russian negotiations were resumed in Istanbul. There were 3 rounds in May, June, and July. We took responsibility for this meeting
worked through and submitted our proposal to the Ukrainian side, a memorandum on ways to regulate as we see it. We proposed to create a Russian-Ukrainian monitoring and control center for ceasefire regime for a certain period to solve humanitarian issues. When the Ukrainian side said, "Nothing is being done in Istanbul, only we have reached some humanitarian agreements on the exchange of prisoners, the return of the bodies of the dead," we said, "Okay, let's create special working groups, one on humanitarian issues, one on military, and one on political issues." This was also ignored. Then they complained, the Ukrainian delegation, that the level of negotiators in Istanbul is not high enough, which does not allow them to make serious decisions. We proposed to significantly increase the level of the negotiating teams, which was also left without any reaction. All initiatives aimed at promoting bilateral dialogue were rejected and simply ignored, as I have already said, thereby confirming that the Ukrainian regime does not want to seek any solutions, agreements. I have said that there were some results in the humanitarian sphere, the exchange of bodies, prisoners. Almost 2,500 people from each side were able to return home. Several stages of repatriation of the bodies of the dead were organized. To date, we have delivered to Kyiv more than 11,000 bodies of the dead soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine, and in return received 201 bodies of our fighters. Despite all the above, Kyiv stated that there was no progress and decided to suspend the negotiations with Russia. The West did not react to this, did not try to incite the Kyiv regime to at least create an impression of readiness for political settlement. But despite all these events, we have a very clear impression that the Kyiv regime needed the negotiations in Istanbul only for one reason. As in the period of the Minsk agreements, under any pretext, to achieve ceasefire without any conditions, and to get a break for rearmament, replenishment of losses, regrouping of forces, and so on. Of course, we did not go for this, and now a new moment has appeared for Zelensky personally. In Ukraine, there was a corruption scandal. And in the light of this, the delay in the conflict seems to have become a political issue for Zelensky, and maybe even a matter of physical survival. For us, the negotiation settlement, as President Putin has repeatedly, including recently, emphasized, is still preferable. We did not refuse the negotiations, which is confirmed by the constructive work on the consideration of the initiatives of the United States. We appreciate the aspiration of our partners at BRICS to contribute to creating an atmosphere for the search for peaceful ways out of the crisis, including, the work of the Group of Friends of the World in Ukraine, which was created by our Chinese and Brazilian partners. We see in these efforts a sincere desire to make a constructive contribution to the stabilization of the international situation. And of course, such work is important to be carried out on the basis of international law. First of all, the UN Charter, in all its fullness, totality, and interrelationship. It is important to achieve, as I have mentioned more than once today, the elimination of the primary causes of the conflict as the most important condition for a stable world. I spoke about the principles of the UN Charter. The West also constantly speaks about the principles of the UN Charter as the basis for resolving the conflict. But the West's statement has a very specific nature. Recently, Merz once again stated that it is necessary to resolve the conflict on the basis of the principles of the UN Charter and respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is an election-based adherence to the Charter. The Charter also speaks about many other things, including, among other things, equal rights and the right of the nation to self-determination. It was the right of the nation to self-determination that became the basis for the process of decolonization, when the peoples of, first of all, African countries refused to live under the authority of the metropolises, because the metropolises no longer expressed the interests of the African peoples. In the same way, today the Kyiv regime does not express the interests of the people of Novorossiya, Donbass, and of course Crimea. Therefore, there should be no double standards.
And when a group of friends of the UN Charter, created by our partners, works on the development of their philosophy, of course, we want everyone to keep in mind the principles of the UN Charter. Moreover, the West forgets another principle of the Charter, the respect for the human rights of any person, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. The Russian language in Ukraine and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church are legally prohibited. I very much hope that many of the countries represented here are members of the UN Charter, but probably given all these circumstances, it would be necessary to take these points into account in the work of the Charter. However, over the past year, the involvement of a group of friends of the world in Ukraine, of certain Western countries, which are directly involved in supporting the Kyiv regime, is hardly contributing to achieving this goal. I mean, in particular, France and Switzerland.
How can they be members of a group of friends, even as observers, when they directly, rhetorically, and practically support the Kyiv regime? As for the Americans, as I have already said, they are, in our opinion, interested in understanding the essence of the Ukrainian crisis.
This was reflected in the meeting of Presidents Putin and Trump in Anchorage on August 15. Mutual understanding was reached there, which is still relevant to us and can serve as a starting point for settlement. Recently, when we had a special representative of President Trump here, Stephen Witkoff, as a result of his meeting with President Putin, both sides, Russian and American, confirmed mutual understanding reached in Alaska. This is a very important result because there was a certain pause after Anchorage. Now, in our negotiations with the Americans on the Ukrainian problem, I personally believe that misunderstandings have been eliminated. And the understanding reached in Anchorage is based on the proposals that President Putin has already, so to speak, summarized and formulated once again in June 2024 regarding the principle of resolving the Ukrainian conflict.
Before Alaska, Stephen Witkoff was also in Moscow, and also brought proposals that were also based on the understanding of Anchorage. The meaning of these understandings is that Ukraine must return to the non-blocking, neutral, non-nuclear basis of its statehood. These principles of non-blocking, neutrality, and non-nuclear status have been recorded in the Declaration on the State of Sovereignty of Ukraine since July 16, 1990. And it was on the basis of the principles declared in this document that we recognized Ukraine's independence. Therefore, when they say to us now, you know, we cannot do anything, because the goal of joining the North Atlantic Alliance is recorded in the Constitution, we recognized another Ukraine, and most of those present here recognized Ukraine in 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as a country, as a state, on the basis of which there were three principles: neutrality, non-nuclear status, and non-blocking status.
Therefore, we should not play with words here, but simply take into account the historical facts. And of course, Ukraine, which was independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had in its laws, in its constitution, as I have already said, guarantees for the rights of the Russian and other national minorities. In that Ukraine, there was no legislative strengthening of militarization and the nationalization of the state and society.
All this now has a place to be. And of course, it is important that these understandings of the need to eliminate discrimination against the Russian language, Russian-speaking citizens, other national minorities. We know well how Hungarian, Bulgarian, Slovak minorities do not feel themselves as full-fledged citizens. And of course, to end the persecution of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. As for the territorial realities, when Zelensky says that he cannot do anything with the territorial issue, because in our constitution it is forbidden to give anything, well, you can immediately pay attention to this character. Of course, he does not always remember what is happening around him, but in the same constitution it is recorded, and I repeat it for the third time today.
the obligation of the state to ensure the rights of the Russian and other national minorities. They did not care about this position of the Constitution. They adopted laws that directly prohibit the Russian language in the sphere of education, culture, mass media. They simply created a filter of mass media. It is impossible to work in the media space if you criticize Zelensky. All mass media, both those owned by Russian owners and those owned by Ukrainians, broadcast in Russian and were critical, are closed. As for the integrity of the Constitution, the rights of people, the rights of citizens are much more important than anything else. And I want to say again that we also have a Constitution, and in accordance with this Constitution, Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions are integral and equal parts and subjects of the Russian Federation. And I will emphasize once again what I have said many times. We do not need territories. We care about the fate of the people whose ancestors have been conquering these lands for centuries, building cities, roads, ports, and whose monuments stand as the founders of these territories. But the rights of these people are now outlined by the Kyiv regime, which is why the population of the subjects mentioned by me in the Russian Federation at one time refused to live under the rule of the neo-Nazi regime at the referendums. And this is probably a topic that cannot be silenced. I assume that the countries present here understand human rights in full accordance with the principle of the UN Charter, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender, race, linguistic, or religious principles. We are well aware of human rights in the West. By the way, after the United States published its document on 28 or 27 points, it was published in the press. You probably have read it. There were quite important statements on human rights, as well as on the denazification of Ukraine. It was written there that it was necessary to protect the languages of minorities, religious freedoms, and that all Nazi ideology and activities should be prohibited. After the contact with the Europeans, the number of points was reduced, and the point that required to prohibit all Nazi ideology and activities disappeared. It is obvious that it disappeared at the request of the Europeans and, of course, the Zelensky regime. As for the rights of ethnic minorities and religious freedoms, for some reason the text says that Ukraine must follow the rules of the European Union regarding the rights of ethnic minorities and religious freedoms. I think the question should be put differently. Ukraine must comply with the UN Charter and the numerous international conventions, including the Universal Convention on Human Rights, rights of ethnic minorities, and religious freedoms. I do not think it is acceptable to reduce its obligations only to follow the rules of the European Union. These rights of ethnic minorities and religious freedoms are not regulated by the European Union. The European Union can do whatever it wants within itself, but it does not need to impose its rules on others. Moreover, we know what minorities, not at all national ones, are being persecuted in modern Europe, and we know how religious freedoms are interpreted. It was enough to watch a broadcast of the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in Paris, and everything will become clear about minorities and religious freedoms. Therefore, we continue to rely on the understanding that was reached with the Americans, developing this understanding of the anchorage. We have sent our American colleagues additional proposals that concerned collective security guarantees. We understand that when discussing security guarantees, we cannot limit ourselves only to Ukraine. The proposals that Zelensky and his hosts in Western Europe are commenting on now have not yet been shown to us. But if we believe what they say in the media, these proposals, in addition to the declaration of a demilitarized zone along the entire borderline, in addition to the creation of a buffer zone on both sides of the border where there will be no heavy weapons, without us it is pointless to discuss everything. But they also say that Ukraine will have an army of 800,000 and that guarantees of Ukraine's security and recovery will be provided. This is, once again, a return to the sad logic of the so-called formula of peace by Zelensky, which pursued the only goal. All attention should be focused on supporting the current neo-Nazi regime, without changing its essence, without changing its policy of suppressing religious freedoms and human rights, and leaving behind the framework of dialogue, the legal interests and security of the Russian Federation. By the way, we have always advocated, since 2010, and even earlier, in 2008, we proposed to the North Atlantic Alliance to form an agreement that would be legally binding and would be dedicated to collective guarantees of security. Even now, President Putin, at a meeting with Witkow and Jared Kushner a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago, clearly said that we understand that guarantees of security should cover Ukraine as well. But the other side wants to guarantee security only for Ukraine, and the guarantees, judging by the information in the press, are being established in such a way as to prepare another attack on the Russian Federation. Of course, we cannot agree to this. We believe that the proposals I mentioned, which we passed on to the United States and NATO back in December 2021, are completely up to date and can become a starting point or one of the starting points of such discussions. Of course, we're ready to consider other proposals. The main thing is that we have a consensus that we can draw on. This is a decision to meet at the highest level of the Security and Cooperation Organization in Europe, in Istanbul in 1999, and in Astana in 2010. No one canceled them. These decisions state that each country can choose an alliance to ensure its security. This is number one. Number two, under all circumstances, no country has the right to strengthen its security by infringing on the security of any other country. This is number two. The third principle that was enshrined in these documents at the highest level is that no country, group of countries, or organization in the OSCE space has the right to claim dominance. NATO was doing exactly this, constantly absorbing states located to the west of the Russian Federation. When we drew the attention of our Western colleagues to the fact that they were behaving improperly and violated the obligations of their presidents and prime ministers, we were told that these were political obligations and not legal obligations. This is it. This is the logic, and this logic will not work. If they intend to adhere to it, it will end badly. Therefore, we are ready to consider all the proposals that have been formulated in a collective context in order to start negotiations, and which should be aimed at reaching fundamental legal agreements. This is the fundamental point. We do not want another crisis to follow. The West wants Europe. It wants to sow the seeds of a new conflict right now. It publicly says that it is preparing for it. We also do not want all our efforts to repeat the sad fate of the Minsk agreements, which, I remind you, were unanimously approved by the UN Security Council. But this did not stop the French, Germans, or other owners of Zelensky, who, in their rage to bring Russia a strategic defeat, did not stop at anything. As you know, I've already mentioned today the American plan of 28 points. Then we met, President Putin met here with Stephen Witkoff, and as I said, we confirmed the understanding of the anchorage, and the work will continue. But at the same time, we see how Europe is in a hurry, how Zelensky is wrestling between Paris, London, and other capitals. And what is being said in the press, and I partially agreed to it, clearly says that the goal is to undermine the efforts of President Trump and his team. For most of these figures, such as Macron, Starmer, Merz, Tusk, Stubbe, von der Leyen, Kallas, the imminent conclusion of the conflict is simply unprofitable. They persistently beat the drums of war, as they say, create coalitions of those who want to, increase military spending, and try to save their political future. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, they threaten Russia with a mythical threat and attack. As you know, they are discussing plans to develop a military Schengen, to reduce the transfer of troops from Western Europe to our borders from 40 days to 3 days. Well, who is preparing for war? They fantasize about sending their servicemen to Ukraine as peacekeepers, in quotes. For us, these so-called peacekeepers will immediately become legal targets. Everyone should understand. Now we had to admit the facts of the direct participation in the war against Russia of British military personnel, special forces. After one of them died, the British government could no longer hide these circumstances. It is stated that at least 100 British subordinates are in the ranks of those fighting against the Russian Federation. Of course, we will make all the necessary conclusions from this another manifestation of the true essence of the British regime. Well, the Europeans, of course, are making plans to increase their forces and resources right on the borders of the allied state of Russia, Belarus. In Poland alone, it is announced that they intend to increase the production of 155mm ammunition by 30 times. Against this background, they are trying to convince everyone that they are not preparing for war, but for a fair world in Ukraine. They claim some role in the regulation. All these Europeans who are proud, like Macron, say that without us, without Europe, no one will solve anything. We do not tolerate, the president said this very clearly, no aggressive plans against NATO members, not members of the European Union, are ready to record in a written legal document the corresponding guarantees, of course on a collective, mutual basis, in the context of the approaches laid out above. But this, I repeat, is us. We are responsible for our words, and on the other hand, there is frankly a military fund, and, as our president said, if Europe decides to fight, we are ready for it even now. The legal aggression does not stop. They use puppet structures such as the International Criminal Court, Europol. They want to establish a special tribunal in the Council of Europe, a register of damage. And as far as we know, these anti-Russian initiatives are being pulled up by the countries represented here. They seek to ensure the participation of representatives of the world's majority, including the so-called diplomatic conference, called on December 15th-16th in The Hague, which is planned to open for signing a convention on the International Claims Commission to consider the claims of the Nazi regime to the Russian Federation for the fact that we protected Russian people from extermination in full accordance with their legal rights, enshrined in the UN Charter. These are our Western liberals and fighters for democracy. It is clear that the true goal of such exercises is to expand the geographical boundaries of the Russophobic campaign, to involve as many countries of the global South as possible in their provocative actions. And of course, to sow discord between Russia and the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America. I have no doubt that our friends and partners understand all this perfectly and will not succumb to such provocations. You know, the general line of our opponents and those who support Ukraine was outlined by Ms. Kyriakilos. The EU has a clear plan on 2 points. First, to weaken Russia, and second, to support Ukraine. This is a masterpiece of diplomatic art, a worthy quote from Annalena Baerbock, who demanded that Putin change his policy by 360 degrees. Europe has said to Ms. Kyriakilos that the main thing is to support Ukraine. We have seen in recent days, and these discussions are particularly interesting, that the support of the Kyiv regime includes a planned robbery by the EU by confiscating sovereign assets of the Russian Federation's currency reserves. Representatives of Western countries, the Prime Minister of Belgium, the leadership of the European Bank for the Reconstruction and Development of the International Monetary Fund, are warning the Brussels democracy against crazy and thoughtless actions. but I do not know how this will affect the relevant figures, such as Ursula and Kaya Kallos, who are conducting quite simple diplomacy. But they must understand that they will have to take responsibility for this very seriously. By the way, Kaya Kallos recently made a statement. She also sometimes makes frank statements about Freud. She said that Ukraine does not need a very fast settlement. Or the head of German intelligence in March this year, Mr. Kohl, said that it is beneficial for Europe to continue the Ukrainian conflict for a few more years while European countries are building up their military potential, preparing for the war with Russia. These are the things, and what are the ideologies of the war with Russia, can be assessed by their arguments for the domestic audience, because these arguments, first of all, are that the Kyiv regime must be supported because it is fighting for European values. But they say that this is actually an act of vengeance, because it means that in the leadership of European countries, they will encourage neo-Nazism, which is legalized in Ukraine, where criminals recognized by the Nuremberg Tribunal as such are heroized at the state level, where racist practices are introduced, where the legislative ban is in effect. I would like to emphasize this again. Russian language and all Russian in general, where there is a pursuit of Russian culture, mass media, the Orthodox Church. No one in Europe complains that all this violates Ustafon and other international treaties of Ukraine. It turns out that this is how European values look like. I think this is a lesson for everyone. But a completely new direction of the protection of European values is demonstrated by the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. This is not a public organization. This is a structure founded 20 years ago by the government of Ukraine, and it has the status of the central body of executive power in the field of preserving national memory. They have a list of persons and organizations who are accused of undermining the interests of the Ukrainian people, and are subject to the so-called decommunization and decolonization policies, as characters who pose a threat to the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian people. This list officially includes writers Turgenev, Bulgakov, Kitaev, Ilf, Babel, Zhvanetsky, Pushkin, Lermontov, composers Glinka, Mussorgsky, artists Surikov, and others. And of course, in the same blacklist, which includes figures of imperialism who pose a threat to Ukraine, in the same list are the Romanov dynasties, Nikolai II and his family, Lomonosov, Bagration. Poltava and Borodino battles were declared illegal. Therefore, it is very difficult to assume that the Kiev regime will be ready for serious negotiations, and, most importantly, for serious agreements. This should probably be taken into account by those who insist that any decision to overcome the extreme crisis can be made only with the participation of the Kiev regime and its European masters. The attitude of Europe to Zelensky and his regime as to the innocent and deserving of support in any circumstances also suggests that the European leaders are doubtful about how useful they can be in negotiations to achieve a strong, stable, and just settlement based on the principles of the UN Charter and the principles of international law. Unlike this group of people, we have a political will for peace. I would like to stress once again that the President is ready to continue the substantive dialogue, first of all with the US side, because it's it that shows a serious attitude to achieving results. And we really want to end the conflict. Our principal position is unwavering. This should be done in a realistic way by eliminating its primary causes, which are well known to everyone. I am convinced that you also understand this. I hope that the additional arguments, additional assessments that we are making today and that we will also make in response to your questions will be useful for your governments in assessing the situation and determining their actions in this regard. Thank you.